Richelieu, 1585 to 1642. 1. Between Two Kings, 1610 to 24. The sudden death of Henry IV left France in a renewed disorder, many rooted in the struggle of the nobles against the monarchy, of the middle classes against the aristocracy, of the Catholics against the Huguenots, of the clergy against the state, of the young King Louis XIII against his mother, and of France against Austria and Spain. The fascinating and demonic genius who resolved all this chaos into order defeated the feudal reaction, pacified the Huguenots, subordinated the Church to the state, saved Protestant Germany from collapse, broke the power of the encompassing Habsburgs, and raised the French monarchy to domestic omnipotence and European supremacy, was a Catholic priest, the greatest, subtlest, and most ruthless statesman in the history of France. It was part of Henry's tragedy that at his death his heir, Louis XIII, was a helpless boy of 8, and that the widow to whom he had left the regency was a woman of more courage than intelligence, willing to surrender the government to Italian favorites, provided she might enjoy the sweets of life in swelling amplitude. She abandoned Henry's plan of a war to the death against the Habsburgs. On the contrary, she allied France with Spain by marrying her children to those of Philip III, her son Louis to Anne of Austria, her daughter Elizabeth to the future Philip IV. The will of Richelieu was to prove stronger than this mingled blood. Henry and Sully had left 41,345,000 livres in the treasury. Concino Concini, his wife Leonora Galigai, the Duke of Epernon, and other thirsty courtiers gathered around this hoard and prepared to consume it. Sully protested but was overruled. He resigned in disgust, retired to his estates, and wrote memoirs of his beloved king. The nobles saw in the corrupt incompetence of the central government a chance to restore their old feudal sovereignties. They demanded and obtained a convocation of the States General, assuming that it would be, as usually in the past, their voice and weapon against the monarchy. But when it met at Paris in October 1614, they were disconcerted by the strength and proposals of the Third Estate, the untitled, untonsured mass of the people, represented then as now by lawyers, and expressing the power and the wishes of the middle class. Nobles and clergy, rating birth and ointment above wealth and law, challenged the new heritability of judicial offices, which was creating a rival nobility of the robe. The tiers-état retaliated by asking for an investigation of the spacious gifts and pensions recently received by nobles from the government. It called for the correction of abuses in the Church. It objected to the application in France of the rigorous decrees of the Council of Trent. It demanded that the clergy be subject to the same laws and courts as the laity, that a check be put upon the further acquisition of realty by the untaxable Church, and that the clergy baptize, marry, and bury the people without charge. Finally, it defended the absolute authority and divine right of the king over the claims of nobles to rule him and of the popes to depose him. This was an unexpected revolution. The troublesome delegates were placated with promises, and the assembly was dissolved, March 1615. The promises were for the most part forgotten, peculation and mismanagement were resumed, and no further States General was called until monarchy, nobility, and clergy alike collapsed in 1789. Nevertheless, the French Catholic clergy now honored itself with sincere and effective self-reform. It was not always responsible for the abuses that disordered the Church, since many of these stemmed from the appointment of bishops and abbots by kings or nobles, half pagan in life, and sometimes skeptical in creed. Henry IV gave Huguenot Sully 4 monasteries for his private support, and made his mistress Corisande abbess of Châtillon-sur-Seine. Noble lords bestowed episcopacies, abbacies, and nunneries upon their younger sons, their illegitimate children, their brave soldiers, their favorite women. As the reform decrees of the Council of Trent were not yet accepted in France, there were few seminaries for the training of priests. Any tonsured youth who could read the Latin Missal and acquire the elements of liturgy was eligible for the sacerdotal office, and many bishops, who had been easy-living men of the world before being rewarded with sees, appointed to pastorates men of little education and less holiness. "The name of priest," said a priest, "has become the synonym for ignorance and debauchery. The worst enemies of the Church," said St. Vincent de Paul, "are her unworthy priests." Père Bourdoise attacked the moral side of the problem by establishing, 1610, the Communauté des Prêtres, which required all the priests of a parish to live together in simplicity and fidelity to their vows. In 1611, Père de Bérulle founded the Congregation of the Oratory, on the model of a similar foundation by St. Philip Neri in Italy. It became a seminary for training young priests to better education and dedication. In 1641, Père Jean-Jacques Ollier organized the Sulpician order to prepare men for the priesthood, and in 1646 he opened the seminary and church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. In 1643, Père Jean, St. John Eudes, formed the Congregation of Jesus and Mary to fit men for the priesthood and missions. So were formed Bossuet, Bourdaloue, and Malebranche of the next generations, and the power and splendor of the Church under Louis XIV. New religious orders revealed and revived the piety of the people. The Ursuline nuns entered France toward 1600 and undertook the education of girls. Within a century they had 1,000 houses and 350 congregations. The Order of the Brothers of Mercy, founded, 1540, in Spain by Juan de Dios, St. John of God, was welcomed into France by Marie de Médicis, and soon provided 30 hospitals. In 1610, Jeanne Frémiot, Baroness of Chantal, Saint Chantal, helped by François de Sales, St. Francis of Sales, established the Congregation of the Visitation of Our Lady for the care of the sick and the poor. By 1640 it had 100 convents. By 1700, one branch alone had 400 nunneries. All in all, there were in France in 1600 some 80,000 nuns. Two men stand out with special prominence in this Catholic revival of the 17th century. François de Sales took part of his name from the town of his birth, near Annecy, in Savoy. He studied law at Padua and became an official of the Savoy Senate. But religion was in his blood. He was ordained a priest and undertook, 1594, the difficult task of winning back to Catholicism the Chablais region, south of Lake Geneva, which had been Calvinist since 1535. In 5 years the mission was accomplished, partly by exiling the unconverted, but mostly by François' persuasive piety, patience, and tact. Raised to a bishopric, he gave himself to teaching children and adults. When he visited Paris, high-born women fell reverently in love with him, and for a time piety became fashionable. The career of Vincent de Paul followed less traditional grooves. He began as a swineherd, but somehow he found his way to a Franciscan college in Gascony. His father, longing, like every Catholic parent, to get his family into paradise by dedicating a child to the Church, sold a yoke of oxen to send his boy to study theology at the University of Toulouse. There Vincent was ordained priest, 1600. On a voyage in the Mediterranean he was captured by pirates, and he was sold as a slave in Tunis. He escaped, went to Paris, served King Henry's divorced Margot as chaplain, and then became spiritual director to Madame de Gondi. With funds provided by this lady, he organized missions among the peasantry. After nearly every mission he established a conférence de charité for the relief of the local poor, and to provide for the continuance of these foundations, he organized the Congregation of the Priests of the Mission, often called the Lazarists, from the priory of St. Lazarus that served as their headquarters in Paris. As Madame de Gondi was commandant of the French galleys, Vincent took to preaching to the galley convicts. Shocked by their hardships and diseases, he opened hospitals for them at Paris and Marseille, and aroused the conscience of France to better treatment of the prisoners. He persuaded well-to-do women to give periodic service in the hospitals. He raised large sums for charitable distribution, and to administer these and help his ladies of charity, he organized, 1633, the Sisters, whom he preferred to call the Daughters of Charity, now serving humanity in their church in many quarters of the world. Physically unattractive, poorly garbed, resembling some wrinkled, bearded rabbi, Monsieur Vincent, by his labors for the poor, the sick, the criminal, won the hearts of nearly all who knew him. He collected great sums, established hospitals, asylums, seminaries, homes for the aged, retreats for laymen and priests. Volumes have swollen with accounts of his benefactions. During the Fronde of 1648-53 and the blockade of Paris, he supervised the feeding of 15,000 destitute persons. Here, however, dogma overcame charity, and he required a confession of Catholic faith as a condition of receiving food. He joined in the campaign against Port-Royal, but tried to soften the persecution of its nuns. When he died, half of Paris mourned him, and satisfaction was universal when the Church, 1737, enrolled him among her saints. Through him and François de Sales and the undiscourageable Jesuits and the ardent service of innumerable women, French Catholicism experienced under Louis XIII a rebirth of vigor and devotion. Old monastic orders returned to their rules. Nunneries reformed themselves. Now began Port-Royal and its Jansenist saints. Mysticism found new advocates and practitioners of absorption in direct contemplation of God. The young king, caught in the fervor of the age, solemnly placed France under the protection of the Virgin Mary, in order, said the royal edict, that all his loyal subjects might be received into paradise, such being his goodwill and pleasure. Watchmen continued, as in medieval France, to awaken the Parisians each morning with a call to prayer for the departed dead. Réveillez-vous, gens qui dormez, priez Dieu pour les trépassés. But the conflict of creeds continued bitterly. Marie de Médicis adhered faithfully, despite her piety, to the Edict of Nantes, but neither Catholics nor Huguenots were disposed to tolerance. The Pope, his nuncio, and the Catholic clergy denounced the government for permitting heresy. Where Catholics dominated, they disrupted Protestant services, destroyed Protestant churches, homes, sometimes lives. Children were forcibly taken from Huguenot parents on the ground that the parents prevented them from fulfilling their desire to become Catholics. Where Protestants dominated, they retaliated in kind. They excluded the Mass from some 250 towns under their rule. They demanded that the government prohibit Catholic processions in Protestant territory. They ridiculed, disturbed, sometimes attacked such processions. They forbade Protestants to attend Catholic baptisms, marriages, or funerals, and their ministers declared that they would withhold the sacrament from parents whose children married Catholics. Said a famous freethinker, while the Catholics were theoretically more bigoted than the Protestants became more bigoted than the Catholics. The preachers rivaled the Catholic clergy in suppressing heresy and criticism. They excommunicated and delivered up to Satan, but did not burn, Jérémie Ferrier for having made fun of ecclesiastical assemblies, and their writings attacked Catholicism in works which, for bitterness of feeling, have hardly ever been equaled, and which it would certainly be impossible to surpass. Fearing repeal of the Edict of Nantes and resenting the alliance of France with Spain, the Huguenots strove to make their part of France politically independent and militarily secure, with its own army and its own laws. When Louis XIII visited Pau, 1620, he was shocked to find not one Catholic church in which to perform his devotions. The young king looked with alarmed resentment upon a faith that threatened to divide not merely the soul, but also the body of France. He searched anxiously amid his court for a man with enough iron in his blood to transform this sundering chaos of creeds and powers into a strong and united nation. 2. Louis XIII. He knew that he himself lacked the physical health and mental force needed to meet these challenges. Begotten in the 48th year of a father perhaps weakened by sexual exuberance, he suffered from tuberculosis, intestinal inflammation, and an embarrassing impediment in his speech. Through long periods he was too weak to indulge in sports. He played and composed music, grew peas for the market, put up preserves, and helped in the kitchen. Heredity and disease left him no charms of figure or face. He was precariously thin, his head and nose were oversized, his pendulous underlip left his mouth always partly open, and his long, livid countenance harmonized with his deliberately drab costume. He suffered no more from nature than from his physicians, who in a single year bled him 47 times, gave him 215 enemas, and poured 212 drugs down his throat. He survived by engaging in sports when he could, hunting, joining his army, sleeping in the open air, and eating the soldiers' simple food. Beaten repeatedly by his teachers, he abominated education and seems never to have read a book except for prayer. He read the canonical hours every day, accepted without question the faith taught him in his growing years, and always joined and accompanied to its end any procession that bore the consecrated host. A neurotic tendency to occasional cruelty tarnished a disposition basically kind. He was shy, secretive, and morose, not much loving a life that had not loved him. His mother considered him feeble-minded, neglected him, and openly preferred his younger brother, Gaston. He responded by hating her and worshipping the memory of his father. He developed an aversion to women, and after some timid contemplation of Mademoiselle de Hautefort's beauty, he gave his affections to young men. Married politically to Anne of Austria, he had to be prodded into her bed. When she miscarried, he left her intact for 13 years. The court advised him to take a mistress, but he had other tastes. Then at 37, yielding to the demands of all France for a dauphin, he tried again, and grateful Anne gave the world Louis XIV, 1638. 2 years later she bore Philippe I of Orléans, who continued his father's appreciation of male charms. Louis was some inches a king. Suddenly, still a lad of 16, tired of Concini's impudence and peculations, he gave secret orders for his assassination, 1617. And when the Queen Mother protested against this termination of her favorite, he banished her to Blois and chose as his chief minister Charles d'Albert, who had suggested the stroke, and who was now made Duke of Luynes. Pressed by the Duke and Pope Paul V, Louis ordered the Huguenots to restore all property that they had appropriated from the church. When Béarn ignored the decree, he marched into the province, compelled obedience, and brought Béarn and Navarre, once his father's personal realm, under the direct rule of the king. The Huguenots made no immediate resistance, but in 1620 their General Assembly, meeting in their strongest city, La Rochelle, demanded the return of the restored property as belonging to the people rather than to the church. Moreover, it apportioned France into 8 circles, and appointed for each of them a chief administrator and a council to levy taxes and raise troops. Louis declared that France could not tolerate such a state within a state. In April 1621, he led one army and his generals led 3 others against the Protestant citadels. Several of these were taken, but Montauban, under Henri, Duke of Rohan, held out successfully. Incompetent generals allowed the war to drag on for a year and a half. The peace treaty of October 9, 1622, forbade Protestant assemblies, but left Montauban and La Rochelle in Huguenot hands. During these campaigns, Luynes died, 1621, and Richelieu climbed to power. 3. The Cardinal and the Huguenots. How does a man make his way to the top? In those days it helped to be well born. Armand Jean Duplessis de Richelieu had for mother the daughter of an advocate in the Parlement of Paris, and for his father the Seigneur de Richelieu, Grand Provost of the royal household under Henry IV. The ancient Poitou family inherited the right to recommend to the king a candidate for the bishopric of Luçon. Armand, 21, was so nominated by Henry, 1606. 2 years too young for episcopacy, he hastened to Rome, lied about his age, and delivered before Paul V so handsome a Latin harangue that the Pope surrendered the see. This fait being accompli, Richelieu confessed his lie and asked for absolution. The Pope complied, remarking, "Questo giovane sarà un gran furbo." This youth will be a great knave. The young bishop described his bishopric as the poorest and nastiest see in France. But there was some money in the family, and he soon had his coach and his silver plate. He did not take his office as a lazy sinecure. He devoted himself assiduously to his duties, but he found time to flatter every influence and pull every wire. When the clergy of Poitou chose a delegate to the States General, 1614, Armand was their man. In that assembly his grave face, his tall, slim figure, his almost legal ability to grasp an issue clearly and present it persuasively, impressed everyone, especially Marie de Médicis. Through her and Concini he was made a Secretary of State, 1616. A year later Concini was killed and Richelieu lost his post. After a brief service with the banished Queen Mother at Blois, he returned to Luçon. Marie plotted to escape. Richelieu was suspected of complicity. He was exiled to Avignon, 1618. His political career seemed finished. But even his enemies recognized his abilities, and when Marie let herself out by night from a window of her castle at Blois and joined a force of rebel aristocrats, Luynes called the young bishop and commissioned him to win the Queen Mother back to reason and the king. He succeeded. Louis secured a cardinal's hat for him and appointed him to the Council of State. Soon Richelieu's superiority of mind and will made itself evident, and in August 1624, aged 39, he became Prime Minister. The king found in him precisely the objective intelligence, the clear purpose, the tenacity of ends, and the flexibility of means wherein he himself was wanting. And he had the wisdom to accept the cardinal's guidance in the triple task of subduing the Huguenots, the nobles, and Spain. In his memoirs, Richelieu remarked appreciatively, "The ability to let himself be served, to delegate authority, is not among the least qualities of a great king." Louis did not always agree with his minister. Sometimes he rebuked him. Always he was jealous of him. Now and then he thought of dismissing him. But how could he reject a man who was making him absolute in France and supreme in Europe, and who was bringing in more taxes than even Sully had gleaned? The spirit of the cardinal showed itself first in his treatment of religion. He accepted without discussion the doctrines of the Church and added a few superstitions surprising in so powerful a mind. But he ignored the claim of the Ultramontanist party that the popes had full dominion over kings. He preserved the Gallican liberties of the French Church as against Rome, and in things temporal he subordinated the Church to the state as resolutely as any Englishman. He banished Father Cossin, who, as the royal confessor, had intervened in politics. No religion, in his view, should mingle with affairs of state. The alliances he formed for France were made with Protestant and Catholic powers indifferently. He applied his principles firmly to Huguenots playing politics. Despite the peace of 1622, they had made La Rochelle a virtually sovereign city under the control of its merchants, ministers, and generals. From that strategic port the merchants plied their trade with the world, and pirates sailed out to seize any booty or any ship, even those of France. Through this port, given Huguenot permission, any enemy of France might enter. Louis, too, had violated the treaty. He had promised to demolish Fort Louis, which was a standing threat to the city. Instead, he strengthened it and assembled a small fleet in the nearby harbor of Le Blavet. Benjamin, brother to Henri de Rohan, Seigneur de Soubise, commanding a Huguenot squadron, captured this royal fleet and towed it in triumph to La Rochelle, 1625. Richelieu built another fleet, organized an army, and accompanied the king to the siege of the Huguenot stronghold. Soubise persuaded the Duke of Buckingham to send an armada of 120 vessels to protect the city. It came, but suffered so sorely from the artillery of the royal forts on the island of Ré that it crept back to England in disgrace, 1627. Meanwhile, Richelieu, acting as general for his sick king, had captured all the land approaches to La Rochelle. It remained only to blockade it by sea. He ordered his engineers and his soldiers to build a mole of masonry 1,700 yards long across the entrance to the harbor, leaving an opening for the movement of the tides. These were so strong, rising and falling 12 feet, that the enterprise seemed impracticable. Every day half the stones laid that day were washed away. The king grew weary of this bloodless warfare and went off to Paris. Many courtiers expected him to dismiss Richelieu for failing to take the city by assault. But at last the mole was complete and began its scheduled work. Half the population of La Rochelle died of hunger. Only the richest could get a little meat. They paid 45 livres for a cat, 2,000 for a cow. Jean Guiton, the mayor, threatened to kill with his own dagger anyone who spoke of yielding. Nevertheless, after 13 months of famine and disease, the city capitulated in despair, October 30th, 1628. Richelieu entered on horseback, followed by soldiers, mercifully distributing bread. Half of France clamored for the total extinction of the Huguenots. Exhausted, they could only pray. Richelieu surprised them with peace terms that seemed to the Catholics outrageously lenient. La Rochelle lost its municipal independence, its forts, and its walls, but the persons and property of the inhabitants were spared. The surviving Huguenot troops were allowed to depart with their arms, and the free exercise of both the Protestant and the Catholic worship in the city was guaranteed. Other Huguenot towns, surrendering, received similar terms. Catholic property expropriated by Protestants had to be restored, but the temporarily homeless Huguenot ministers were compensated by a state subsidy of 200,000 livres, and, like the Catholic clergy, they were exempted from the head tax, or taille. A general amnesty was granted to all who had shared in the rebellion. Henry IV's Edict of Nantes was confirmed in every essential by Richelieu's Edict of Grace, June 28, 1629. Positions in the army, navy, and civil service were kept open to all without question of creed. Europe was startled to see French Catholics following and honoring Protestant generals like Turenne, Schomberg, and Henri de Rohan. From that time, said Richelieu, differences in religion never prevented me from rendering to the Huguenots all sorts of good offices. With a wisdom tragically lacking in Louis XIV, the great cardinal recognized, as Colbert was to do, the immense economic value of the Huguenots to France. They abandoned revolt, gave themselves peacefully to commerce and industry, and prospered as never before. 4. The Cardinal and the Nobles. He proceeded with equal resolution and less lenience against the nobles, who still held France to be many and not one. Feudalism was by no means dead. It had fought in the religious wars for control of the central government. The great nobles still had their fortified castles, their armed forces, their private wars, their private courts, their officers of law. They still had the peasantry at their mercy, and charged obstructive tolls on commerce, traversing their domains. France, dismembered by feudalism and religion, was not yet a nation. It was an unstable and agitated assemblage of proud and semi-independent barons, capable at any moment of disrupting the peace and the economy of the state. Most of the provinces were ruled by dukes or counts who claimed their governorships for life and handed them on to their sons. It seemed to Richelieu that the only practicable alternative to this enfeebling chaos was to centralize authority and power in the king. Conceivably, he might have labored to balance this by restoring some measure of municipal autonomy, but he could not restore the medieval commune, which had rested on the guilds and a protected local economy. The passage from a city to a national market had undermined the guilds and the communes, and required central rather than local legislation. To minds frozen in the perspective of today, the royal absolutism desired by Richelieu seems but a reactionary despotism. In the view of history and of the great majority of Frenchmen in the 17th century, it was a liberating progress from feudal tyranny to unified rule. France was not ripe for democracy. Most of its population were ill-fed, ill-clothed, illiterate, darkened with superstitions, and murderous with certainties. The towns were controlled by businessmen who could think in no other terms than their own profit or loss. And these men, hampered at every step by feudal privileges, were not disposed to unite with the lesser nobles, as in England, to establish a parliament checking the royal power. The French parlements were not representative and legislative parliaments. They were superior courts, nurtured and mortised in precedent. They were not chosen by the people, and they became citadels of conservatism. The middle classes, the artisans, and the peasants approved the absolutism of the king as the only protection they could see from the absolutism of the lords. In 1626, in the name of the king, Richelieu issued an edict that struck at the very base of feudalism. He ordered the destruction of all fortresses except on the frontiers, and forbade in future the fortification of private dwellings. In the same year, his older brother having been killed in a duel, he made dueling a capital crime, and when Montmorency-Bouteville and the Count de Chapelle duelled nevertheless, he had them put to death. He confessed himself much troubled in spirit by this procedure, but he told his master, "It is a question of breaking the neck of duels or of your Majesty's edicts." The nobles vowed vengeance and plotted the minister's fall. They found an eager ally in the Queen Mother. Once the patron of Richelieu, she came to hate him when she saw him opposing her policies. When Louis fell gravely ill, July 1630, she and the Queen nursed him back to semi-health and asked, as their reward, the cardinal's head. In her own palace, the Luxembourg, Marie de Médicis, thinking Richelieu far away, repeated the demand with passionate urgency, and offered as a willing replacement Michel de Marillac, keeper of the seals. Richelieu, coming by a secret passage, entered the room unannounced and confronted the Queen Mother. She confessed that she had told the king that either she or he, Richelieu, must go. The harassed king withdrew and rode off to his hunting lodge at Versailles. Courtiers flocked around Marie, rejoicing in her expected victory. But Louis sent for Richelieu, confirmed him as prime minister, assured him of the royal support, and signed an order for Marillac's arrest. The plotting nobles were thrown into angry confusion by that day of dupes, November 10, 1630. Marillac was allowed to live, but his younger brother, a marshal of France, was later indicted on a charge of peculation, and was rather summarily put to death, 1632. Louis ordered his mother to retire to her chateau at Moulins and to withdraw from politics. Instead, she fled to Flanders, 1631, formed a court in exile at Brussels, and continued to work for Richelieu's fall. She never saw the king again. Her other son, Monsieur, Gaston, Duke of Orléans, raised an army in Lorraine and led it in open rebellion against his brother, 1632. He was joined by several nobles, among them the highest in France, Henri, Duke of Montmorency, governor of Languedoc. Thousands of the aristocracy rallied to the revolt. Near Castelnaudary, September 1st, the 37-year-old Montmorency engaged the forces sent against him by Richelieu. He fought till brought down by 17 wounds. His and Gaston's army, rich in titles but poor in discipline, fell to pieces under attack, and Montmorency was captured. Gaston surrendered and, as the price of pardon, named his accomplices. Louis ordered the Parlement of Toulouse to try Montmorency for treason. Its verdict was death. The last of the ducal Montmorencys died without fear or complaint, saying, "I hold this decree of the king's justice for a decree of God's mercy." Most of France condemned the cardinal and the king for unfeeling severity. Louis replied, "I should not be king if I had the feelings of private persons." And Richelieu defended the execution as a necessary notice to the aristocracy that they too were subject to the laws. "Nothing so upholds the laws," he said, "as the punishment of persons whose rank is as great as their crime." Two further obstacles remained to Richelieu's supremacy: the governors and the Parlement. Resenting the loss of provincial revenue through malversation and incompetence in noble governors and in bourgeois or petty noble magistrates, the cardinal sent to each district intendants to supervise the administration of finance and justice and the enforcement of the laws. These royal appointees took precedence over local officials of whatever rank. Local autonomy declined, efficiency and tax collections rose. Anticipated in some measure by Henry IV, suppressed by the nobles in the Fronde, consolidated by Louis XIV, adapted by Napoleon, this system of intendants became a major feature of the centrally controlled bureaucracy that henceforth administered the laws of France. The Parlement of Paris thought it opportune, under a weak monarchy, to extend its functions from the registration and interpretation of the laws to the role of an advisory council to the king. Richelieu would not brook such rivalry to his Council of State. Probably under his prodding and with his sharp phrasing, Louis summoned the leaders of the Parlement and told them, "You are constituted only to judge between Master Peter and Master John. If you go on as at present, I will pare your nails so close that you will be sorry." The Paris Parlement yielded, and the provincial Parlement followed suit. Even their traditional functions were curtailed. Richelieu set up extraordinary commissions to try special cases. France became a police state. The cardinal's spies were everywhere, even in the salons. Lettres de cachet, orders in secret, became a frequent instrument of government. Richelieu was now, in effect, King of France. 5. The Cardinal Supreme. With this concentrated power in his hands, he did everything for France, little for the people. He thought of France as a power, not as a sum of living individuals. He did not idealize the common man, and he probably thought it dulce et decorum that such men should die for their country. He would sacrifice them to make the future France secure from Habsburg encirclement. He labored far into the night at the business of the state, but almost always on foreign policy. He had no time to improve the economy, except to ferret out tax evaders and bring revenue and intelligence to Paris with less leakage on the way. In 1627 he organized a public post. Taxes were still collected by financiers to whom they had been farmed. These men had exacted twice, sometimes thrice the amount they transmitted to the government. The nobility and the clergy were exempt from the major taxes. Clever businessmen and the hordes of officials found ways of avoiding or appeasing the collectors. Towns paid a small composition to escape the poll tax. The brunt of the burden fell upon the peasantry. Richelieu bled it to destitution to make France the strongest power in Christendom. Like Henry IV, he preferred to conquer enemies with money rather than with blood. Many of the treaties with which he waged war included subsidies to allies and douceur to potential foes. At times, desperate for funds, he advanced his own money to the treasury. Once he hired an alchemist to make gold. Taxation and the state corvée, unpaid labor on the roads, cooperated with drought, famine, pestilence, and ravages by soldiery to bring peasants near to suicide. Several killed their families and themselves. Starving mothers killed and ate their infants, 1639. In 1634, according to a probably exaggerated report, a fourth of the population of Paris begged. Periodically and sporadically, the poor rose in revolts that were mercilessly suppressed. Richelieu used the taxes to build armies and a navy. Right would not be heard unless it spoke with guns. Having purchased the office of Grand Admiral, he fulfilled its functions resolutely. He repaired and fortified harbors, established arsenals and provision depots at the ports, built 85 ships, founded pilot schools, trained marine regiments. He raised 100 regiments of infantry, 300 troops of cavalry. He restored discipline in the army. He failed only in his efforts to banish prostitutes. With his revitalized armament, he faced the chaos of foreign relations bequeathed by the regency of Marie de Médicis, returned to the policy of Henry IV, and directed all his forces to one goal: the liberation of France from the cordon of Habsburg power in the Netherlands, Austria, Italy, and Spain. Marie had allied France to Spain. That is, in Richelieu's view, she had submitted to the enemy, and she had alienated those on whom Henry IV had relied as friends, the English, the Dutch, and the Protestants of Germany. With the quick strategic eye of a general, Richelieu saw in the Valtelline passes that connected Austria and Spanish Italy the key to the united power of Spain and the empire to exchange supplies and troops. For 12 years he struggled to win those passes. His wars against the Huguenots and the nobles distracted and defeated him. But he retrieved with diplomacy far more than he had lost in war. He had won to his faithful service François Leclerc de Tremblay, who had taken the name Joseph on becoming a Capuchin monk. Father Joseph was sent everywhere on delicate diplomatic missions and performed them skillfully, and France began to pair the grey-garbed monk as Eminence Grise, his grey eminence, with the red-robed Richelieu as Eminence Rouge. So aided, the cardinal vowed that he would prove to the world that the age of Spain is passing and the age of France has come. In 1629, the epochal conflict in Germany seemed about to end in the complete triumph of the Catholic Habsburg emperor over the Protestant princes. Richelieu turned the tables with money. He signed with Gustavus Adolphus, 1631, a treaty by which the virile King of Sweden, aided by 1,000,000 livres a year from France, was to invade Germany and rescue the Protestant states. The ultramontanists of France denounced the minister as a traitor to the faith. He retorted that neutrality was treason to France. When Gustavus died in victory at Lützen, 1632, and most German princes yielded to the emperor, Richelieu actively entered the war. He expanded the French armies from 12,000 in 1621 to 150,000 in 1638. He helped the revolt of the Catalans in Spain. His diplomacy gave him control of Trier, Koblenz, Colmar, Mannheim, and Basel. His troops took Lorraine and forced their way through Savoy to Milan, the center of Spanish power in North Italy. Then the pendulum of fortune veered, and all these victories seemed meaningless. In July and August 1636, a strong force of Spanish and imperial troops crossed the Netherlands into France, took Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen, and Corbie, advanced to Amiens, laid waste to the green valleys of the Somme and the Oise. Richelieu's armies were far away. The road to Paris lay open and defenseless to the enemy. The Queen Mother in Brussels, the Queen in Saint-Germain, and her pro-Spanish party in France rejoiced and counted the days before the cardinal's expected fall. In Paris, angry multitudes pullulated in the streets, calling for his death. But when he appeared among them, outwardly calm on his stately horse, no one dared touch him, and many prayed God to give him strength to save France. Then appeared not only his courage, but his foresight and industry. He had long ago organized the citizens of Paris into a reserve militia. He had stored up arms and materials for them. Now he inspired them with fervor, and they responded to his call. The Parlement of Paris, the corporations, and the guilds voted funds. In a few days a new army was on the march, and it laid siege to Corbie. Gaston of Orléans, in command, dilly-dallied. Richelieu came up, took charge, ordered assault. On November 14th, Corbie was taken, and the Habsburg troops retreated into the Netherlands. In 1638, Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, leading a German army financed by Richelieu, took Elsass. Dying a year later, he bequeathed it to France. Elsass and Lothringen became Alsace-Lorraine and began to be French. In 1640, Arras was taken. In 1642, a force under the command of the king and the cardinal captured Perpignan, and the surrounding province of Roussillon was detached from Spain. Everywhere Richelieu seemed now the organizer of victory. The unreconciled nobles, the Spanish faction at the court, the high-born ladies palpitating with intrigue, made a last effort to unseat the minister. In 1632, after long serving the cardinal in diplomacy and war, the Marquis of Effiat died, leaving a widow and a handsome 12-year-old son, Henri Coiffier de Rouzet, Marquis of Cinq-Mars. Richelieu took the lad under his protection and introduced him to the king. Perhaps he thought with this toy to distract Louis from Mademoiselle de Hautefort, who was among the intrigantes. It so transpired. The king was charmed by the youth's looks and wit and insolence, made him master of the horse, begged him to share the royal bed. But Cinq-Mars, maturing to 21, preferred the pretty courtesan Marion de Lorme and the exalted Marie de Gonzague, future Queen of Poland, now one of the cardinal's loveliest enemies. Probably at her suggestion, and inflamed by her strategic retreats, the youth importuned Louis for admission to the royal council and for a command in the army. When Richelieu discountenanced these proposals, Cinq-Mars begged the king to dismiss the minister. Refused, he joined Gaston of Orléans, the Duke of Bouillon, and others in a plot to surrender Sedan to a Spanish army. With this army at their back, the conspirators were to enter Paris and take possession of the king, and Gaston pledged himself to arrange the assassination of the cardinal on the way to Perpignan. Cinq-Mars' friend, Jacques-Auguste de Thou, solicited the cooperation of the queen. But Anne of Austria, expecting Louis's early death and her elevation to power as regent, sent a hint of the scheme to Richelieu. He pretended to have a copy of the agreement with Spain. Gaston, believing it, confessed, and as usual betrayed his associates. Cinq-Mars, de Thou, and Bouillon were arrested. Bouillon, as the price of pardon, confirmed Gaston's confession. The two youths were tried by a court at Lyons. They were unanimously condemned, and they dignified their treason with a stoic death. The king hurried back to Paris to protect his power. Richelieu, mortally ill, was carried in a litter through a France dying of victories and crying out for peace. 6. Epitaph. What was he like, this cardinal who was hardly a Christian, this great man who felt that he could not afford to be good? Philippe de Champaigne sent him down the ages in one of the most famous paintings in the Louvre. The tall figure, saved from absurdity by raiment, given authority by red robe and hat, posing as if in some forensic plea, proclaiming his nobility in his clear-cut features and delicate hands, challenging his enemies with his sharp eyes, but pale with exhausting years and saddened with the consciousness of inexorable time. Here is the worldliness of power crossed with the asceticism of dedication. He had to be strong to keep his faults from defeating his purposes. He began his career at court with an ingratiating humility, which he later avenged with a pride that admitted only one superior. Once, when the queen visited him, he remained seated, a discourtesy permitted only to the king. He was, like most of us, vain of his appearance, avid of titles, resentful of criticism, eager for popularity. Jealous of Corneille, he wished to be known also as a dramatist and a poet. Actually, he wrote excellent prose, as his memoirs show. As readily as Wolsey, he reconciled the following of Christ with a cautious attention to mammon. He refused bribes and took no salary, but he appropriated the income of many benefices, alleging his need to finance his policies. Like Wolsey, he built himself so splendid a palace that before he died he thought it wise to present it to the Dauphin. So the Palais Cardinal became the Palais Royal. We may suppose that it was built for an administrative staff and diplomatic show, rather than for personal extravagance. He was no miser. He enriched his relatives and could be generous with the money of the state. He bequeathed half of his personal hoard to the king, advising him to use it on occasions which cannot abide the tardiness of financial forms. What appears as his unfeeling cruelty was to him a necessity of rule. He took it for granted that men, certainly states, could not be managed by kindness. They had to be intimidated by severity. He loved France, but Frenchmen left him cold. He agreed with Cosimo de' Medici that a state cannot be governed with paternosters, and with Machiavelli that the ethics of Christ cannot be safely followed in ruling or preserving a nation. A Christian, he wrote, cannot too soon forgive an injury, but a ruler cannot too soon punish it when it is a crime against the state. Without this virtue, of severity, which becomes mercy in so far as the punishment of one culprit prevents 1,000 from forgetting it, states cannot survive. It was Richelieu who gave currency to the phrase raison d'état, that is, the ethical code must give way to reasons of state. He seems never to have questioned the identification of his policies with the needs of France. Hence he persecuted his personal enemies as firmly as he punished the foes of the king. Within his castle and his diplomatic front he was human, longed for friendship, and felt the loneliness of the exalted. Talleyrand's gossipy historiette would have us believe that Richelieu tried to make a mistress of Marie de Médicis, who was 20 years older than he. It is highly improbable. There are other legends of the cardinal's secret amours, even with Ninon de l'Enclos, and it would not have violated the mores of the time if the harassed statesman had consoled himself with contours. All that we know clearly of his affections is that he was profoundly attached to his niece, Marie-Madeleine de Combalet. Widowed soon after marriage, she wished to enter a convent, but Richelieu persuaded the Pope to forbid it. He kept her near him to manage his household, and he received from her a devotion intenser than most loves. She dressed like a nun and concealed her hair. Richelieu conducted himself toward her with all due propriety, but the queens refused her the benefit of any doubt and gave a lead to gossip that added another sting to the cardinal's tale. He loved not man nor woman neither, and both took their revenge. What he had above all was will. Few lives in all history have been so unified in their aim, so undeviating in its pursuit. The laws of motion could not be more constant. We must admire his devotion to his tasks, his wearing himself out in them through years of labor and nights without sleep. He dedicated those labors to those who could sleep without fear under cover of his sleepless care. We must concede him a surpassing courage, which faced powerful nobles and scheming women, stood them off, killed them off, dauntlessly, amid repeated plots against his life. He risked his head time and again on the issue of his policies. He was seldom well. Having contracted a fever from the marshes of Poitou, he was subject to repeated headaches, which sometimes lasted for days on end. Probably his nervous system was genetically weak or congenitally injured. One sister was feeble-minded, one brother was for a while insane, and court rumor said that the cardinal himself had fits of epilepsy and mad hallucinations. He suffered from hemorrhoids, boils, and a disease of the bladder. As in Napoleon's case, his political crises were occasionally complicated by inability to urinate. More than once his illnesses led him to think of retiring. Then, imprisoned in his will, he took hold again and fought on. We cannot judge him fairly unless we see him wholly, including features that will take form as we proceed. He was a pioneer of religious toleration. He was a man of wide and sensitive culture, a connoisseur of music, a discerning collector of art, a lover of drama and poetry, a helpful friend of men of letters, the founder of the French Academy. But history properly remembers him above all as the man who freed France from that Spanish dominance which had resulted from the religious wars and which, in the League, had made France a pensioner, almost a dependency of Spain. He achieved what Francis I and Henry IV had longed and failed to do. He broke the cordon strangulaire with which Habsburg powers had encircled France. Later pages must detail the far-seeing strategy whereby he decided the 30 Years' War, saved German Protestantism as the ally of Catholic France, and made it possible for Mazarin to mold the constructive Peace of Westphalia. For France itself, he created unity and strength at the cost of a dictatorship and a royal absolutism that in time generated the Revolution. If it is a statesman's prime duty to make his people happy and free, Richelieu fell far short. Cardinal de Retz, a shrewd but not impartial judge, condemned him as having established the most scandalous and dangerous tyranny that perhaps ever enslaved a state. Richelieu would have replied that the statesman is required to consider the happiness and freedom of future generations as well as of his own, that he must make his country strong to guard it against alien invasion or domination, and that for this purpose he may justly sacrifice a present generation for the security of its successors. In this sense, Richelieu's Spanish rival, Olivares, rated him the ablest minister that Christendom has possessed these last 1,000 years. Chesterfield ranked him as the ablest statesman of his time and perhaps of any other. His return from his final victory at Roussillon was the funeral procession of a still living man. From Tarascon to Lyon he took a barge on the Rhone. At Lyon he remained till Cinq-Mars and de Thou were tried and dead. Then, weak from the pain of an anal fistula, he had himself carried to Paris in a litter borne by 24 men of his bodyguard, and large enough to contain a bed for the dying man, a table, a chair, and a secretary to take dictation of army orders and diplomatic messages. 6 weeks that death march took, and along the road people gathered to get a glimpse of the man to whom they could give not love, but fear, respect, and reverence, as the awesome embodiment of both church and state, the vicar of God and King. Arrived in Paris, he was moved into his palace without leaving his couch. He sent in his resignation to his master, who refused to accept it. Louis came to his bedside, nursed him, fed him, wondered what he would do if this incarnate will should cease. The cardinal's confessor, giving him the last sacrament, asked him if he had forgiven his enemies. He answered that he had never had any except the enemies of France. After a day of coma, he died, December 4th, 1642, aged 57. The king decreed an entire week of funeral ceremonies. Through a day and a half, sightseers filed by his corpse. But in many provinces people kindled bonfires in gratitude that the Iron Cardinal was dead. He continued for a time to rule France. He had recommended Giulio Mazarini as successor to his ministry. Louis complied. He left 10 volumes of memoirs, recording the actions of the state as if they had been not his but the king's. In his final years he had dedicated to Louis a testament politique, to serve after my death for the administration and conduct of your realm. Here, amid some platitudes, are precise and pithy maxims of government, in a style rivaling any other prose of the time. He advises the king to avoid war as something for which his majesty was by nature unfit. It is more profitable and more glorious to reconcile a dozen enemies than to ruin one. Besides, he confided, the French are not constituted for war. At the start they are all ardor and bravery, but they lack the patience and phlegm to await the propitious moment. As time goes on, they lose interest and become soft, to the point where they are less than women. A king, like a general, must have a masculine courage capable of resisting emotional inclinations. He should give women no voice in government, for they follow their moods and passions rather than their reason. However, intellect in a woman is unbecoming. I have never seen a woman of much learning who was not marred by her knowledge. Women cannot keep secrets, and secrecy is the soul of statesmanship. A prudent statesman will talk little and listen much. He will watch lest he give offense by some careless word. He will never speak ill of anyone unless the interest of the state requires it. The king should get a general knowledge of the history and constitution of all states, especially his own. And the author asks some understanding for his ministry and his character. Great men who are appointed to govern states are like those condemned to torture, with only this difference. that the latter receive the punishment of their crimes, the former of their merits. The king survived him by 5 months. Louis's brief rule was gratefully remembered, for he released political prisoners, suffered exiles to return, and allowed France to breathe. He complained that the cardinal had not permitted him to act as he wished. His mother had died a few months before Richelieu. He had her remains brought from Cologne and gave them stately burial, and in his last moments he repeatedly prayed that God and man would pardon the harshness he had shown to her. He saw himself failing, but rejoiced in the vigor and beauty of his 4-year-old son. "What is your name?" he asked playfully. "Louis XIV," answered the boy. "Not yet, my son, not yet," said the king, smiling. He bade the court accept the regency of the queen until his son should come of age. When he was told that death was near, he said, "Then, my God, I consent with all my heart." He died on May 14, 1643, aged 41. People went to his funeral as to a wedding, Tallemant reported, and appeared before the queen as at a tourney. The terrible cardinal had made everything ready for Le Grand Monarque and Le Grand Siècle.